Okay, so hello and welcome back to another video. This week I'm going to be doing something a little bit different and answering some questions that I've got off you on Instagram and off various social media platforms. So I thought I'd come out in the garden, seeing as it's 27 degrees almost here, which is ridiculous, and answer them outside. So let's get straight into that. Let's answer some frequently asked questions, things that you guys wanted to know about videography and filmmaking. Okay, so jumping straight in, I'm going to answer a few questions I got off Instagram. I am at AndyFlushFilms_. Annoyingly, I couldn't get it without the underscore. So do follow me there. I post some filmmaking things. I post, various bits and bobs behind the scenes, what I'm up to on my videography and filmmaking journey. So yeah, follow me there and you'll get more out of that channel. But here are some questions I got off that one. So the first question I got was someone asking if they wanted to become a filmmaker as a career, if it was worth going to university or whether it was worth just going straight into it, kind of learning as you go and learning on the job. Now, that is a very, very difficult question that no one can really answer, as it clearly works both ways. Even at the level I'm at now, I've got friends who didn't go to university and people I know that didn't go to university and jumped straight into either filmmaking or kind of working in TV and film and are working in that industry and have managed to kind of do that transition perfectly. On the other side of that, I've got people and friends that went to university or studied film and are also working in TV, in videography, or in one of those kind of adjacent industries. So clearly there isn't actually a defined answer here. I think a lot of people get drawn into this kind of idea that there's no point to going to film school, there's no point going to university if you're studying film, and that is definitely something that I disagree with. I studied a digital filmmaking course in Liverpool, and to be honest, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing without that course. It's a really complicated one because it's not necessarily that it teaches you how to work in the industry. In fact, my course specifically didn't teach me any of that, in my opinion, but it teaches you filmmaking. It teaches you obviously all the different kind of like technical aspects that you need to know if you want to become a videographer, especially if you're going to want to go and work in actual TV or film industry and work your way up, then fair enough, some of that stuff might not be quite as relevant. I think having a specific kind of understanding of the technical aspects of filmmaking is really important as you kind of do get onto sets and you are kind of working as whether it's a runner or something. I think you're definitely going to have a foot up or a slight advantage if you do know these things. So I think definitely it's something worth considering if you're interested in that path. I suppose on a really basic level, is it going to get you into the industry? No. Having a film degree on my CV, to be honest, doesn't really help me get jobs at all. It hasn't got me any jobs. It hasn't got me any kind of work. It is kind of purely based on, on the videography side, it's based on my portfolio and it's based on the work that I've done and the work that I can show. And on the kind of, working in film or TV side, it's just based on your CV. So it's literally going to be a case of, going and getting runner work, getting, camera assistant roles and things like that on smaller productions and, then working on your CV and, creating a better CV that you can jump up the ladder with. So no, it's not going to get you a job, but it's definitely going to give you the technical skills and kind of the theoretical knowledge that you might need or you might want if you want to become a filmmaker. So yeah, so I know that's a very wishy-washy answer that doesn't really answer the question specifically, but it's because there really isn't an answer. I think you can definitely get a lot from going to university. I know that kind of doing 2 years straight of actual filmmaking, being around the craft, working with people, meeting people that were involved in the same things, can be hugely beneficial. And I think without that, I don't know that I'd ever have had the drive to actually go and kind of learn all that stuff in the first place. So yeah, it's never a black and white question. But please don't go into university thinking that it's going to get you into the film or TV industry, because it isn't. It can just kind of give you a really nice platform to then go and do it afterwards, if that makes sense. One last thing I will say on the matter though is that I don't want people to buy into this kind of like hatred of film school and university that I see online as well. There's definitely videos I've kind of watched and been really pissed off by on YouTube, very clickbaity headlines of like, fuck film school, don't go to university, stuff like that. And I think that's definitely, a stupid approach as well. Like, as I've said, it puts you in an environment to learn these things. And if you haven't already done that, because obviously some people have, I've got mates who, went to college and had already done filmmaking and had been making films before already. But if you haven't done that, I think university or, film school, college can be a really good way to do it and kind of get you immersed in everything. So yeah, I mean, as with all things, kind of it's not really black or white, one end of a scale or the other. Don't buy into the idea that you're going to instantly be working in film and telly, but also don't be so negative and buy into this idea that it's stupid or a waste of time, because honestly, for a lot of people, I don't believe university is a waste of time. But, that's a whole other topic and let's not go there. One more thing I will say on that matter though, which I just realized and remembered, is university, no matter what course you're doing, whether it's film, photography related or even not, you're not going to get a lot out of it if you don't kind of put extra work in. And it's not to say you're going to be spending every hour of the day doing homework, but if you're really kind of invested in a, thing or a process like filmmaking, what's really going to get you ahead is kind of learning it all as well on the side. So, whether that's going on YouTube and watching a ton of tutorials or, kind of just immersing yourself in film in other ways. Yeah, don't expect university to kind of do it for you. You are going to have to put that time in as well. Anyway, that one was extremely long-winded, so let's move on. Okay, I'm getting attacked by dogs. Oh my days. Okay, well, she's going to be in the shot now, cool. So the next question I got off Instagram was one that I really wanted to talk about, which was opinions on Sony versus Canon mirrorless cameras. Please ignore the dogs. Oh my days, they've decided to have a fight. So like most of the answers to most of these questions, this is not going to be a black or white answer. Sony and Canon are both doing really, really good things in the video space today. I do think Sony kind of technically maybe has had an advantage over the last couple of years just in terms of innovation. And they've been bringing out, a lot of new cameras with a lot of new specs. They're really pushing forward in things like autofocus and, other kind of tools that filmmakers use. So there definitely are sort of technical things that maybe Sony are doing better, but then people have argued for years that Canon color science is better and that the image overall looks nicer and skin tones are better and stuff like that. So there really isn't an answer either way. I think a lot of times I always liken it to people who either have a PlayStation or an Xbox. I think people tend to pick one for whatever reason, whether it's their friends having one, whether it's they've used the camera at university or whatever it is, and they kind of tend to stick with it. And I think that is realistically how it tends to work. I think if you have a prosumer or professional level Canon or Sony camera, you're going to be getting a lot of the same kind of features. None of them are doing higher resolution than the other ones. None of them are doing amazingly better autofocus. They're all kind of at the same level if you're looking at the same price point. Yeah, it's a kind of a case of just buy whichever one that you feel comfortable with or that you've worked with in the past. One thing to bear in mind is that you're not going to be jumping systems back and forth very often unless you want to spend a lot of money, because accessories, lenses especially, are very brand focused. All of my lenses are the mount for Sony cameras. So as long as I stick with mirrorless Sony cameras, full frame even, that's going to be fine. But if I was to suddenly buy a Canon camera, the very least I'd have to buy a mount adapter, and there's electronic problems there and they're not always the best, etc., etc. So yeah, do look into it and spend time researching which one you want, because you're not going to want to change very often. The other thing you want to look at if you're buying one of these cameras and you're choosing which brand is just kind of like future-proof it. So, if you're buying a Sony, A6000 or one of those kind of lower level cameras, look at, okay, well, what can I buy next if I choose to upgrade? If my videography continues to go well, if I'm making money off it, if I can kind of progress and upgrade, like I have with the Sony FX3, look down the line, look at what you might get next. Because for example, if you get a camera that isn't full frame and then you buy one that is, you are gonna have to buy different lenses, or at least they're not gonna work the same. It's gonna be equivalent lens size and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, just do your homework, but yeah, there isn't really one or the other. It is literally up to whichever one you prefer and that you feel comfortable with. Okay, next question, and this one is off my YouTube channel, off one of the previous videos. This one says, as a super beginner in the world of video, whenever I try to record on my DSLR or mirrorless, I can never get the focus right. Is manual better, or is there a good autofocus mode for video? Now, this is another one I really, really wanted to talk about because, like the kind of Sony versus Canon situation, this is a really kind of hot topic that's commonly discussed and that filmmakers love to argue about. Now, at the risk of sounding boring, like the other two questions, there is no specific right answer, but I will say there's a really big argument towards one of the ways, at least for my situation, on this question. I think the thing you really need to remember with manual focus versus autofocus is it is dependent on your situation and your filmmaking style. So the business I run is almost always a one-man band operation. I am filming on my own, so the kit I've bought and the way I've kind of set up my gear is to let me operate on my own. Now, having a camera that has amazing autofocus like the Sony FX3 is fantastic for this. I am almost always picking out faces. I'm very rarely racking focus, although you can now on this camera just on the click of the screen. And having a system this good at autofocus means it's kind of just one less thing to think about for me when I'm filming a lot of the time. If I point this camera towards a crowd of faces, it's going to pick out a face and it's going to be laser sharp on their eye and it's going to stick on them. That is what my clients want most of the time. If you're shooting weddings or events, for example, this is going to be incredible, as you're just never going to have to worry about, getting that important moment. Oh, oh no, it wasn't in focus, what a nightmare. Because realistically, that is the biggest nightmare in filmmaking. If you have a shot that you think was amazing, you get back to the edit and it's not in focus. Focus is one of those things you really can't get wrong. I've heard people be like, oh yeah, it's close. Nope, it's not good enough. If you're videoing a subject, the focus really needs to be laser sharp on their eye. People can tell, people know it's wrong if it's even, somewhere else on their face, if it's getting their ear and not their eye, it feels wrong. So yeah, aim for the eye. If you've got a camera that does eye track autofocus, that's the setting you want to use, because at the end of the day, contrast-based will only go so far. It might pick out a face, but it's the eye that needs to be in focus. There's no point having a really shallow depth of field. If it's the tip of the nose that's in focus, it's going to look rubbish. So yeah, I know in the past it's been a bit of a thing where people have been kind of anti-autofocus, saying that it's a bit of a hack and a bit of a cheat, and that you don't learn good focusing techniques and stuff like that. But again, it really depends on what your kind of filming style is. If I was shooting a film, like a short film, like I have done multiple times, I do tend to use manual focus almost all the time, because I don't want any risk of it kind of hunting or moving around or picking something else out in the shot. I want to be making sure that it's picking out exactly only what I want to be in focus. So, that is a time you want to use manual focus for sure. But if I'm run and gun, if I'm filming someone, client work for promos and stuff like that, and I kind of want to just make sure that, someone's eye is going to be in focus, especially if it's only one person in the shot, which makes it very easy. I'm always using autofocus. It's on my camera most of the time because it's just a simpler way for me to make sure that the shot is going to be usable. If you're shooting commercial video or any kind of promotional material, there is going to be a lot of things to think about. Especially if you're doing it on your own, it's a really kind of quite actually an intense job at times, and it can be quite stressful. Worrying about focus and making sure that's laser sharp is just another thing to do that you really don't need to do if you've got a decent camera these days. And I think personally, to be honest, it's actually a real kind of knock against cameras like the Blackmagics these days. People are picking them up for, the kind of work that I'm doing at a kind of a promotional level. And to lose out on any real autofocus system, I think is kind of lacking. And I think obviously it's one of the reasons Blackmagic can keep their cameras, at a certain price level. Clearly the image, often is better and more cinematic, dare I say it. But, losing autofocus is a real kind of issue there for me. So it's definitely one of the reasons I chose the camera that I chose. And again, going back to the question, it's something you need to bear in mind. Do you need autofocus or not if you're going to be buying a certain camera? So yeah, again, it goes both ways, but it's really dependent on what you want to be filming. And I think autofocus is definitely not something to kind of laugh at or ignore. If your camera does it, kind of get to grips with how it works on your camera, learn whether or not you want to use it, what scenarios you want to use it in, and use it because it's there for you. It's a tool for filmmakers. So yeah, use it. It's great. I just want to jump in really quickly at this point and mention something that I sort of had forgotten about. The autofocus on the FX3 that I'm using is so good that it's actually kind of rejuvenated a lens I wasn't ever using. I have a 50mm Sony f1.8 lens that in reality I couldn't use on my own camera. I couldn't use with autofocus because it just wasn't good enough. When you kind of, that stopped down and you've got that much depth of field, it was really, really struggling to ever kind of get anything in focus. And it was kind of just generally really struggling. So I didn't really use it. And it was a lens I kind of abandoned, didn't have in my kit very often. That is completely changed now. And I use this lens all the time, and it's one of my favorite lenses. And that is purely because of the autofocus capabilities of this camera. So there's just another reason to use autofocus. Okay, so the next question was quite different. I had a question that said, what is your favorite scene in a film? And this one was very, very difficult to answer. I'm going to be controversial and say I don't even have a favorite film. I think with films and TV shows and stuff, it kind of really depends on your mood and what you want to watch at a certain, given time. So, I have top films. There's probably a list of 10 plus films I could list off that, are up there with my favorites. But to pick out one scene from them that, is the best, I don't know if that's even possible. I will say there are definitely scenes on TV more so that kind of stand out as being like, super memorable and like just incredible, in a TV series. One example this brings to mind straight away for me is the Loot Train Dragon scene from Game of Thrones. I think that's just an incredibly shot scene. I think it's the kind of the first time, Game of Thrones spoilers by the way, kind of the first time in the show that, two major characters have kind of come up against each other and we don't really know who to root for because by that point, Jaime Lannister's kind of a good guy, Khaleesi's still kind of a good guy and, there's real stakes on the line. And I think just when you added that tension to the way that scene is shot, the stunt choreography in that work is amazing. I actually had the pleasure of working alongside one of the women who runs that stunt team, or at least as part of that stunt team. So that was definitely special to kind of get some stories off her, in terms of how that all worked and kind of how that was to film. But yeah, that scene is just incredible. It's tense. The music is fantastic, which adds so much to film. So I think, yeah, a scene like that kind of stands out. But favorite scene from a film? I don't even know, you know. Like, I'm literally racking my brain and I actually can't think of any. Like, there's definitely ones that are up there, but they're all going to be quite similar. So maybe that just gives away my film taste. But I mean, yeah, like the big speeches in the Lord of the Rings films, like the Helm's Deep speech right before they ride out, the Pelennor Fields speech before they ride out, and there's a theme here. You know, these are all incredible and they're definitely up there. But yeah, favorite scene, it depends how I'm feeling, what film I want to watch. You know, there's incredibly sad films that I've really enjoyed that I don't want to watch again ever, really. So yeah, that's not really a question I can answer, unfortunately, but great discussion. So another question I got off Instagram, which really interested me, was someone asked, so how do you go about licensing music to use in commercial video? And this is a really interesting question because it's something I actually struggled with for a long time. I didn't really understand how to do it for a long time. No one ever kind of taught me it. And if you Google it, there isn't really like a kind of blanket answer, like this is the best way to do it. But there are some really good solutions nowadays. So this is going to sound like a sponsored segment, and it really isn't, but let me talk about one way of doing it that you can now do on various sites. So it's not really sponsored by one person, it's sponsored by a whole category of websites. I think the single easiest way of licensing music for promotional video now is to use a website like Epidemic Sound, Artlist, or one of those sites that gives you, I don't know if they're royalty free technically, but basically they're licensing tracks to you. You pay a subscription, you pay a different level of subscription, kind of based on what you're using it for. This is really important. You need to make sure you don't get caught out by this, because Epidemic Sound, for example, which I use, has various tiers for what you're using them for. So for example, there is a content creator tier, I think it's called, where basically for a YouTube channel or kind of, you know, a single creator that's just making their own content, you can license the music off Epidemic Sound and use that in your YouTube videos. They ask for a YouTube channel, and then basically it just whitelists your channel against any copyright strikes, and, you know, Bob's your uncle. That's a great way of doing it. I think that's about £10 a month. So honestly, that's a really good deal if you're making YouTube content. Epidemic Sound also has a next tier up, which is the one that I use, which is a kind of third-party content creation subscription. So this means that the songs that you're licensing from them are also applicable and allowed to be used by other people if you've made it. So this gets really complicated, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know behind the scenes how Epidemic Sound deals with it still, but basically they're saying that if you've created a video and you can prove you've created it and you made it, if someone else is using it, you know, because they've bought your services, then it's still licensed for them. So it basically creates third-party, you know, licensing. And this is the one that I use. This is the one that I've always done. I think it covers everything on the internet. I don't think it covers TV, which has never been an issue for me yet. Hopefully I reach that stage one day. But yeah, for the stuff I'm doing on the internet, you know, most of my content goes onto websites or socials and stuff like that. This license has always covered me. I've never had issues with Epidemic Sound. You need to be careful if you're using a different site. You need to make sure that, you know, what you're going to use your videos for is covered. The worst thing you'd want to do is to, you know, give a client a video, say, yeah, this music's all licensed, you know, you can use it kind of thing, put it online, or they put it online, and then they get flagged and there's no solution because it's not licensed for them. That could be a real headache. It's definitely something that I kind of came close to having issues with earlier in my kind of career. So yeah, definitely be careful with that one. Music licensing is not cheap. I think the content third-party creation thing is like £40 to £50 a month still, so it's a real expense and you do need to build it into your pricing. Clients don't like paying for music, they just think there's no point. I can tell you now that 99% of the clients I've worked for, at least at kind of, you know, the smaller level, just don't understand it. If I tell them, oh, by the way, it's £50 more to license the music, they won't want to do that, they won't pay it. They'll look for something free, or they'll, you know, try and find something else. And it's a hard battle then to tell them that you can't just use someone else's music. The amount of times I've made a video and then someone's gone, oh yeah, can we use an Ed Sheeran track on it? And I'm like, not if you want it to go on the internet or have any kind of monetization over it or any kind of legal right over the video. So no, unfortunately, no, you can't use Ed Sheeran. Music licensing is a really complicated thing in general, and I still don't understand the ins and outs of it really. So you do need to do homework on it if you're trying to license music for projects. If you can have someone make music for a project, then amazing. It's a really good way of doing it, but I doubt you'll be able to do that for the same cost as licensing something online, if I'm honest. Most music creators won't work for less than £50 for a project, so yeah, that doesn't really make sense to me either. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and just be careful with it because you don't get stung. One off my YouTube channel, how do you make video look more like film? It's a stylistic choice, so you don't need to, ever. What does film even look like? Is it a different thing? Is it just grain? It's a really kind of complicated question. I'm really not going to get too much into this one. You can emulate a film look, of course. There are ways of doing it, but there's actually so much more that goes into it, and a lot of that is going to be lenses. A lot of the kind of look of an image, a lot of the character, if you like, of an image comes from lenses, and, you know, people using really, really fucking expensive lenses on big productions, and, you know, vintage lenses and all sorts of, you know, anamorphics, very cinematic, for example, things like that. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to emulate a kind of film look. But if you do want to just kind of make it look a bit older or a bit more kind of characterized, there are definitely things you can do. You know, you can add grain, you can add, you know, film grain, Super 16, kind of, you know, whatever it is. You can find them online for free. Just whack them over top of your footage. You'll definitely kind of create a more of a vintage feel, but again, you need to make sure that it's kind of something you're actually going for. You don't want to do it for the sake of it. There are things you can put on your lenses. For example, I'm using a 1/4 Pro Mist filter, which I think kind of really kind of softens the lens, takes away some of that digital look, which is definitely something that people have an issue with, I think, and can make it feel more filmic again. It's basically just kind of trying to make something look older, in my opinion, if you say you want to make it look like film. So yeah, I mean, look into those things. There are ways of doing it, but I wouldn't focus too much on it unless you're actually kind of trying to make something look rustic or old. You know, like I did with my Robo Priest film I shot that was, you know, black and white, kind of had film grain on it because it was meant to look like a 60s sci-fi film. So yeah, kind of do it if it's relevant, but if it's not, I wouldn't worry too much about it. What is the best editing software to use? I can't really answer that one because I've only really ever used two. I've only ever used Adobe Premiere, the Adobe Creative Cloud suite. As expensive as it is, and it crashes all the bloody time, and it's a pain in the arse, and it takes forever to update for some reason. But the Adobe Creative Suite is probably the best bang for your buck you're gonna get, to be honest, at a lower level. It does do everything you'd need, I think, really, to be professional filmmaking. I know Deadpool was edited in Adobe Premiere Pro, apparently. That's kind of something they marketed quite heavily at the time. So yeah, the Adobe Suite's probably the best way to go, because if you're paying for a subscription, you are gonna have access to Photoshop. So if you're a content creator, for example, you know, you're gonna have access to, yeah, Photoshop to make your thumbnails, After Effects if you want to do any kind of, you know, special effects or anything on your footage. You're gonna have, you know, Illustrator, Dreamweaver, etc., etc., etc. So you're gonna have a suite of things to use. I think on the other side of things, you've got Final Cut Pro, which is definitely still something that's used in industry. I know people that use it. Again, it kind of does all the same things, arguably runs slightly better because it's built properly and isn't buggy as hell. But it's only available on Mac, so if you're using a PC, you can't use it. So that kind of rules that out. Then you've got things like Avid, which I think are still pretty much industry standard. I could be wrong on that. Avid's really expensive, and I think it's a bit less intuitive to use, perhaps. But I think if you're kind of working in TV or film, maybe Avid's probably still what you'd use. Avid Media Composer, I think it's called. So maybe that's one to go for if you're kind of trying to get into real kind of commercial or, you know, TV editing and stuff. But yeah, like a lot of these things, like with the cameras, if you get one that does everything you need to do, then it's not really an issue. You just want to be using one that is at least as close to industry standard as possible. If you're not using something like that, you're probably missing out on features that you need. And if you do ever kind of upgrade and, you know, get yourself to a higher level, you want to be already versed in those, you know, pieces of software. So yeah, I'd use Premiere Pro, Final Cut Pro, or Avid if you're going to be editing at a serious level. One final question, I think, and something I found really, really interesting and that gets a little bit legal. Someone asked me whether or not you need to obtain legal permissions for anyone that's in your video. Now, this is something I've come across actually lots of times, and I've kind of had different answers both sides. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so obviously don't take any legal advice from me specifically, but this is a question that's gotten more and more complicated over the last couple of years as people get more and more ridiculous about GDPR in the UK. If you Google, can I take photos of someone on the street? The answer is yes. At least from what I found in my research over the years, there is no legal reason you can't take a random photo of a random person and post it online without their permission. You don't have to have specific permissions to film in public spaces. If you're on private land, if you're in someone's venue, for example, this might not be the case. You might need permissions. So it's always best to check. I certainly wouldn't be going out taking videos of people without asking them, just as a courtesy thing. I think it can definitely come across as rude and kind of weird. But then we have street photographers who literally do that, you know, for a career, and, you know, they're lauded and it's amazing. So yeah, basically, long story short, you can take videos of photos of people in public spaces. You need to watch out for it if you're in private land or if you're in a private space. So do you need to use release forms if you're doing video? Again, no. If people consent to be in a video, they don't specifically need a release form to make that legally the case. Again, it kind of falls into what level of filmmaking you're at. If you're shooting something smaller where, you know, a lot of people that are going to be in it aren't ever going to even see it or aren't really going to care, then in reality, from my experience, no, you don't need to kind of ask any more than just, you know, the initial consent. When I do Vox Pops, for example, which is when I go to a theatre or, an event, and I'll kind of interview people on the spot basically and say, ask them how they're enjoying the show and stuff like that. They often go into promotional videos, and this is actually kind of a bread and butter piece of work I do. So obviously we'll ask someone if they want to come over and do one of these Vox Pops, and that's them giving consent to be in the video, but we don't do release forms. I've never had a problem with it. We don't kind of, ask them after or worry about that. If someone wants to email me or get in touch with me and say, look, I know I filmed that with you, but I don't want to be in that video, we just wouldn't use it. It's not really a legal issue at that point because it's not going to be challenged legally at this level. I think if you're making a feature film for a lot of money, clearly your actors need to have release forms signed, make sure they're okay with it and everything like that. But if you're just doing kind of promotional or commercial, videos, if people consent to being in a thing, that seems to be enough legally. I've never had any issue with it. Don't listen to anyone that tells you need to have GDPR fucking waivers for people. It's bollocks. You don't. It's just companies getting scared that they'll get legally looked at. It's not an issue. If you're in a public space or if someone consents to be in your video, that's enough. So yeah, don't worry too much about it. Just be courteous as you would in your everyday life. Don't shove a camera in someone's face if they don't want it in there. And for the most part, ask people if they're going to be on video. The way I tend to look at it is just kind of how prominent they are in the shot. If someone's walking through the background, I'm not going to ask them if they want to be in the video or if they're okay. But if someone's being interviewed, then clearly you need to ask them for permission and, let them know where it's going to go. The question I come across a lot when I'm filming is, where's this going to be? Is this going to be on the internet? And that's people just basically just asking whether or not they're okay with it. So if you say, yeah, it's going onto YouTube, it's going to be on the, Facebook page for this company, they go, cool. That's fine. That's enough. Don't worry about it. Move on. I know I said the last question, but I came across one more in my Instagram DMs, which I thought was fascinating. 4K or 1080p? Now, even 6 months ago, I would have given you a very different answer, but I will start by saying no client I've ever worked for, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's at every level, I work at a relatively small company level for the most part, but no client I've ever worked for has ever asked for a video in 4K. So, do I need to film in 4K and do I need to export in 4K then? Well, no, is the simple answer, and for the longest time I didn't. On my old camera, on the Sony A7S II, you could only go up to 4K at up to 30 frames, I believe it was. So if I wanted to do any sort of slow motion in the project, 4K was essentially out of the question. Obviously you can switch back and forth and kind of, scale down and stuff, but it wasn't something I did very often. I didn't want to lock myself out of frame rates, and I didn't want to have to kind of deal with multi-sized media in post. So no, for the longest time I just shot in 1080 and it was fine. Since I bought the new camera and the FX3, you can shoot 4K at all the resolutions, apart from like 240 frames per second, but who uses that? So it's a very different question now. I tend to shoot everything in 4K, all my YouTube stuff's in 4K, and I am now exporting a lot more in 4K, but it's essentially because I can, it's not because I need to. So it really comes down to whether or not you need to, whether or not you want to for the look. Clearly it looks better, it's sharper. And the other thing you really need to bear in mind is storage space. 4K resolution is about 3 to 4 times bigger files just across the board. So, if I'm shooting 10-bit 4K on this camera, I am rinsing through card space. I get about an hour's footage on a 128 gig card, which is ludicrous in my opinion, and it's definitely something I've kind of had to, learn over time to deal with. You're going to need more memory cards, you're going to need more storage space on your computer, you're going to need more hard drives to store stuff on, and sending files to clients is going to be more of an issue. I tend to use something like WeTransfer to send a client a final video, but WeTransfer, the free version is up to 2 gig. So if I shoot in 4K and the video is quite long, I'm going to be really kind of making that bitrate rubbish if I want to shoot in 4K and keep it in 4K. So there's compromises you've got to make all over the place to shoot in 4K, but I would say clearly it does look better, it is sharper, it gives you more room in post. If you want to kind of shoot 4K, edit in 1080 and then kind of, punch in, you're keeping the resolution, so that's something you can do. Yeah, so there's no real answer. The standard of the industry is moving towards 4K. Most, if not all, kind of stuff that's being produced now for television is being put out in 4K. All of your big YouTubers, at least in the kind of camera and filmmaking space, are shooting in 4K because it looks better. YouTube now looks better in 4K. I think they've kind of upped their bit rate that it'll actually let you show something at. I think if you want to future-proof and you can afford the card space and you don't mind the workflow, because it's harder on your computer as well, then I think shooting 4K. But it's still not a necessity. At the end of the day, what's in your frame is always going to be more important. I would much rather see a high quality video at 1080 than a low quality video at 4K, goes without saying. It's like everything else in filmmaking. You need to focus on the important stuff first. If I make a rubbish looking video in 4K, it's not going to matter. No one's going to care, no one's going to watch it. Yeah, shoot in 1080 if you need to, shoot in 4K if you can. It's more of a luxury than a necessity at this point. And yeah, I think that's it. So that probably got a bit long-winded, but I hope you enjoyed my questions I got through, YouTube and Instagram there. I think it's probably answered a few questions that people kind of wanted to know from me, and a few kind of FAQ type things that kind of come up again and again as well. So this was a bit of a longer form video. I think this is probably going to end up being quite a long one. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope there's some information that, you got something out of. I'm going to go and have a cold shower because it is horrifically warm outside. So yeah, I will see you next week.